Hello, my name is Sophie van Linthout, and I'm the coordinator of basic science at HFA. And today I have the pleasure to discuss together with Arantxa Gonzales, who is the chair of the Committee Basic and Translational Science and Basic and Translational Scientist, and Peter van der Meer, who is board member of the HFA and a clinical and translational scientist. And we will talk today about basic science at HFA, more specifically, discovery to impact translating heart failure science that matters. So, Peter, maybe a first question to you with that topic. How actually does one proceed from an interesting discovery finally to eventually a product? I think this is
Well, Sophie, that's I think a quite difficult question. How you come from a discovery to something which is meaningful eventually for the patients. Why we do it, and it really depends, of course, on the discovery you have. Like, so it could be that if you did some mouse studies and you identify an interesting gene related to, like, let's say hypertrophy or remodeling or metabolic effects. I think if you start off with murine data or from cell lines, I think it's very important to try to make the translation to the clinical practice. So you could go for example, to GWAS data and see whether that specific target also pops in your GWAS data associated with the disease you're studying, or as a biomarker, it might be a proxy RNA sequencing of your PBMCs from patients. So I think it's very important. Also, if you think later on, how can you get a discovery, or if you target that gene or that protein, or how that eventually would lead to a product. And I think everybody's always very afraid, like, does targeting that specific gene also lead to side effects? So I think it's very important to make the translation through to a clinical perspective.
Yeah, you pointed it already out. So you mentioned basic science, you mentioned cell lines, you mentioned mouse models and so on. On the other hand, you also address already clinic, you mentioned patient cells and so on. So maybe the question first to Arantxa, how important in that matter is then actually the interaction between basic scientists and clinical scientists? Because if I follow from Peter, this is really important for the interaction. So how do you see this?
Absolutely, Sophie. I mean, this is really a key point because interaction between basic scientists and clinicians is really essential to move forward with innovation, because mechanistic advances are only going to be meaningful if they are really rooted to answer an unmet clinical need. And in this sense, really successful translational ecosystems really profit from this bidirectional interaction. As Peter mentioned, I mean, hypotheses should raise from the bedside, from getting actually access to the patient samples, bringing these hypotheses to the lab where they can be studied, and then doing the way back to the clinic and testing their clinical relevance. And in this current world where research is becoming more complicated, I would say that, multidisciplinary teams involving not only clinicians and basic scientists like biologists and biochemists are important, but we need also to include engineers, data scientists, specialists in artificial intelligence, and of course people with a background in industry that really see the challenges in bringing an idea from the academia to a product that is scalable and can be applied into clinical practice.
And I think that also what you're saying, like, applies to, so if you have a discovery and, for example, you didn't file an IP for it, I think the interest for investors to bring it further, I think, are very limited. So I think it's also important, and every university has it, like these TTO, so the tech transfer officers. So how can you bring your discovery eventually to something meaningful for the patients? Because it's really not like all IP, it's all about money, earning, etc. No, it's not. If there is no IP, I think the chances that a discovery would eventually fly and become something available for patients are limited. So I think it's very important to have these discussions with your with the TTO in your institute.
You addressed there now IP, which is, I think, or also regulatory affairs, which is really already a niche and quite far already in the translational readiness scale. And if I speak from myself, I think that in that context, the basic scientists as well as clinical scientists are not really trained for that. So maybe that as a bridge. So how do you see what is actually also needed with respect to education to improve this translational science? And how do you see how can also HFA maybe help in that?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good point. And sometimes meetings are very clinical or they're very basic. So there is not really cross,
Yeah.
talk between the two species, so to say. So I think, for example, also here at the HFA, it is very important that we have these translational and basic sessions. So the clinicians can easily walk in, have learn about the more basic stuff, and also during these talks, having the clinical perspective, the basic perspective, and a translational perspective. I think in these sessions, and I think the HFA, the ESC are very important for that platform. And like as we're sitting here at the HFA meeting, I think it's very important to have these meetings here.
Yeah, indeed, if I may add on what Peter was commenting, also from the HFA, we have the basic and translational committee on research that's really trying to focus and emphasize what Peter is mentioning, really help to, bring together the both sides, because in order to work together, we need to understand each other, right? And sometimes it may seem that we are speaking a little bit of a different language. So these initiatives, as Peter mentioned, in the HFA Congress, also consensus papers led by the group dealing with these aspects, I think are an important point to really bring together clinicians and basic scientists. And of course, the flagship of the HFA in this regard is the Heart Failure Winter Meeting on Translational Research that, as you know, because you are the organizer, Sophie, will take place in Berlin next January, which is an excellent opportunity to really foster this interaction between clinicians and basic scientists.
Yeah. Yeah, fully agree. Maybe Peter, still with respect to clinical scientists. So the added value of getting insights into basic science. Maybe also clinicians see this, let's say, a little bit strict of okay in a research project. But what is your take on the fact that learning from mechanisms that also in a way can help clinicians in their clinical practice of looking differently to patients? So can you also in that context a little bit elaborate?
Yeah, so I think sometimes the basic science is sorry, the basic science is sometimes perceived as quite difficult if you have all these knock-in, knock-out models, overexpression, knockdown, short hairpins. How is it actually looking if you have these different difficult constructs? So I think if you go to such a talk as a clinician and you're not used to see these data on a regular basis, it seems very difficult. And I think that's also the role for more basic scientists to, if you have a meeting like this, that your basic science should be understandable, even if you're not an expert in the field. It would be the same like if an electrophysiology would go dive immediately very deep into the ECG recordings, intracardiac. I think for a general cardiologist, these are also difficult to understand. So
Yeah.
I think and of course, I'm not saying that it should be only a very superficial talk, but at least one or two slides, like, where we talk about what are we doing here, is very important. So at least then you get some crosstalk, because if everybody dives immediately into their very specialized thing, the crosstalk is probably quite difficult.
Yeah.
And the physician scientist, so the clinician who's also very often in the lab, and they're somewhat rare, I would say, unfortunately. And I think also in the training's perspective, we should give the opportunity for residents cardiology, but for all specialties, that there is definitely also a track possible for translational science, but it's more difficult to combine.
You mentioned it. Question to you both. So that clinical scientists are indeed becoming more and more rare or endangered even. And this due to the raising complexity of all what is also in basic science there. And it cannot be covered all in the normal training of a fellow, of a clinician. So addressing again the importance of here at HFA, what we bring at basic science, be it here, but also, of course, at the winter heart failure meeting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I can only subscribe what Peter just mentioned in the previous question, that we really all need to make an effort to make things understandable to each other. I mean, not just focus on our very specific area of expertise and, going super deep, because we want to reach everybody and to be able to talk to everybody. And we also have to be aware that we cannot cover everything, as you said. So multidisciplinary teams with the combination of everybody working together, but with differentiated expertise, I think it's the way to go to really advance in translational cardiology.
And maybe as a last comment, I jump on that again with respect to the winter heart failure meeting, that it is really a meeting for basic and clinical translational scientists, where exactly that what we are now discussing, we try to have that in a format so that sessions are built up in a way that we have first two presentations which are basic science, but coming into what are the techniques or what did we learn new, but then having also lectures more, what is then the clinical applicability, right? And also we have boot camps, so also that clinicians who have not a lot of time to get into how now to interpret single cell data or etc., who then in a short time get to know, so that indeed they can at least understand the language. You do not need to be the expert in that, but you need to be able to interpret it or to say, for that is available. Now I need someone who is doing that. And then again, to how we can work together.
No, I fully agree. And I think that's really one of the big things of the winter meeting, to also to have a part of educational in there, like the boot camps you were saying. And I think also here at the HFA, that would be an opportunity also for the future. So like a lot of clinicians are here, let's have some introductory session about how to, well, what you're saying, like interpreting single cell data, what can you get out of it, or other, like what kind of experimental models are there, pros and cons. So I like that approach very much. I think it's very viable.
Yeah, great. Okay, then having that said, I thank you both for this fantastic discussion. And of course, to you all, we invite you to the next winter heart failure meeting in January 2027, from the 18th to the 20th of January. So very welcome. Thank you for your attention.